Committee met and reported a rule, House Resolution 1017, providing for consideration of two bills. Under current law, banks and credit unions providing services to state-licensed cannabis businesses are subject to criminal prosecution and regulatory penalties under federal law. Therefore, businesses which legally grow, market, or sell cannabis in states where it is legal are generally locked out of the banking system, making it difficult for them to maintain a checking account, access credit, accept credit and debit cards, meet payroll, or pay tax revenue. This has created a significant public safety risk as these businesses are forced to operate as cash-only businesses in an industry with billions and billions of dollars of transactions. These high-volume cash businesses are being targeted by violent criminals and putting our communities at risk. I want to share a few examples of how bad the public policy and public issue has become. In November 2021, over the course of 1 week in Oakland, California, more than 25 cannabis businesses had their stores vandalized and robbed and lost upwards of $5 million. A Colorado dispensary chain saw 15 burglaries during a 90-day period in mid-2021, with criminals driving vehicles into their buildings, cutting holes through rooftops and walls, and attacking the stores with pry bars and sledgehammers. Washington State is averaging more than a robbery per day at dispensaries. In fact, recently in the Seattle Times, it was reported that there were 3 deaths related to robberies of dispensaries. The robber, a policeman, and owner of a store. This is just last week. This is an untenable situation for these businesses, their employees, and their customers. If Congress fails to align federal and state law, crimes targeting dispensaries will only get worse. The cannabis industry remains one of the fastest growing industries and now supports more than 428,000 jobs with nearly $25 billion in state legal cannabis sales per year. The time to pass the MORE Act and right the injustices in our community is now. This rule also provides for consideration of H.R. 6833, the Affordable Insulin Now Act, to address skyrocketing insulin costs. Over 37 million Americans have been diagnosed with diabetes, and in Colorado, there are over 300,000. The Affordable Insulin Now Act will require Medicare Part D and health insurance plans to cover insulin and cap out-of-pocket cost sharing at $35 per month. Prescription drugs like insulin force Coloradans to make difficult financial decisions. In a 2020 report from the Colorado Attorney General, approximately 40% of all survey respondents reportedly who are using insulin are forced to ration their use of this life-saving product at least once a year. I'm proud the steps Colorado has taken to ensure individuals have greater access to insulin. In 2021, Colorado became the second state in the country to limit insulin prices by enacting an insulin affordability program. No one should have to pay more than $35 a month for insulin. The passage of this legislation will lower costs for insulin users and save money for hardworking Americans. I commend Representative Angie Craig and all my colleagues for their work on this bill. I urge all my colleagues to support the rule and the underlying bills, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
And Mr. Speaker, I thank the representative from Colorado for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Today we are here to consider H.Res. 1017, a rule providing for consideration of H.R. 6833 and H.R. 3617. This rule makes, in order, no Republican amendments, completely ignoring the flaws of each underlying bill and the thoughtful concerns raised by my colleagues. Not only do my colleagues not want to debate these issues, but they also don't appear to even want to acknowledge them. First, I want to address H.R. 6833, the Affordable Insulin Now Act, which would require health insurers to cover selected insulin products without applying any deductible or imposing any cost sharing in excess of $35. This bill is just a partisan exercise that will only reshuffle the decks for how patients pay for insulin. It is not a serious attempt to address rising prices. The price controls in this legislation would be an expansive intervention into the free market and will most likely lead to an increase in premiums for everyone. Let's not forget, one of the reasons drug prices are rising is because of Washington and the majority's runaway spending, leading to the greatest deficits in American history. Instead of admitting that their wildly expensive spending bills have caused inflation, my colleagues claim that companies have suddenly decided now is the time to raise prices arbitrarily. Congress cannot keep dumping money into the economy and then blaming American companies for the problems it creates. We need to be focusing on getting our debt under control and stop the war on American industry so that we can reduce prices, not just on drugs, but on everything. Furthermore, addressing only insulin establishes a problematic precedent and fails to take into account the high prices associated with countless other necessary drugs, like those for cancer, heart disease, and a slew of other conditions. A sincere attempt by Congress to solve this problem would be to focus on ways to reduce pricing through market-based forces. For example, Republicans on the Energy and Commerce Committee have offered several proposals which would improve price transparency so that Americans could see the real cost of their drugs and make choices accordingly. Instead of working with Republicans to advance these solutions, the majority has yet again elected a go-it-alone approach that has yet to achieve any results for the American people. Next is H.R. 3617, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, a broad bill that would remove pot from the list of scheduled substances under the Controlled Substances Act and eliminate criminal penalties for anyone who manufactures, distributes, and possesses marijuana. This rule makes no Republican amendments in order, which is proof that the Democrats just want to push this bill as a messaging bill. That said, there are several concerns with this bill. First, it fails to set any standards to prevent marijuana use by those most vulnerable to abuse, minors. In fact, back in September, when Mr. Fitzgerald offered an amendment to alter the definition of the term minor to align with other provisions in U.S. Code, the majority voted against it. Without this amendment, crucial protections for our youth are left out of this bill. In committee, I even offered a motion to consider an amendment that would maintain existing penalties for selling pot to minors. It was defeated along party lines, a stunning position for Democrats to take. But not only does this bill legalize pot, it creates a new government program to assist people in opening pot stores. Let me repeat that. This bill creates a government program to help people open pot stores. This bill also ignores the issue of driving under the influence, even though driving under the influence of marijuana can have deadly consequences, something law enforcement officers across America have warned about. Additionally, what happens if an illegal immigrant is arrested for driving under the influence of marijuana? This is not addressed. Republicans in the committee sought to ensure that this bill does not impede with the deportation of illegal immigrants who have been arrested for driving under the influence. That was also rejected along party lines. There are so many issues our constituents are facing today, yet we are here spending time considering legislation to legalize pot that is not only flawed, but it is also dangerous. We could be working on lowering gas prices, tackling the snowballing federal debt, or addressing the inflation affecting every American today. But instead, I guess the majority wants us to get as high as today's gas prices and spend tax dollars on pot stores. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I oppose the rule and the underlying bill. I ask members to do the same, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to remind my friend from Minnesota who's talking about party line votes. We want to bring down the cost of prescription drugs, whether it's insulin or across the board, which we've done in the Build Back Better bill that's sitting in the Senate. And I can say, I think virtually every single Republican voted against negotiating prescription drug prices. Want to talk about a free market, you ought to be able to negotiate prescription drug prices so that Americans across the board get the best possible prices for their drugs. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, a prominent and distinguished member of the Rules Committee.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the distinguished and by his own admission highly caffeinated gentleman from Colorado, my Rules Committee colleague and great friend, Mr. Perlmutter, for yielding me time. I rise today in support of the rule and the underlying legislation. In particular, I'd like to say a few words about the Affordable Insulin Now Act. Over the past 2 decades, the cost of prescription diabetes drugs like insulin have artificially skyrocketed by more than tenfold. A few years ago, I was proud to commission a report by the House Committee on Oversight and Reform to determine the extent of this price gouging and how it is affecting communities across the country, including my own in Rochester, New York, and the impact it's having on patients, especially older adults and our uninsured population. The results of that review were staggering. In communities across the country, out-of-pocket costs have risen by 400% for the Medicare program and beneficiaries over the last decade. The average price for a standard unit of insulin in the United States was more than 10 times the average price in a sampling of 32 other countries. These excessively inflated prices have real consequences in how patients manage this chronic disease. I've talked with many patients and families in my own district that have had to ration their dose or stop taking this life-saving and life-sustaining medication altogether. For the richest and most powerful nation in the world, to allow this to continue is nothing less than shameful. In passing this bill, we are taking the first step of many to rein in these inflated costs and protecting patients to ensure the best possible health outcomes. I'm so proud to deliver for my constituents back home, and I look forward to voting for this rule and getting one step closer towards seeing the bill passed into law. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I'll reserve.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to provide for consideration of Congresswoman McMorris-Rodgers and Congressman Westerman's American Energy Independence from Russia Act. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the majority is continuing to prioritize things like legalizing marijuana, constituents in my district continue to send photos of their energy bills and prices they are paying at the gas pumps. Since President Biden took office, gasoline prices are up by more than 50%. Gasoline prices are up more than 50%, natural gas is up more than 25%, and diesel fuel is up more than 47%. These price increases are on top of crippling, record-high inflation that is a tax on the American people of every stripe, class, and creed. When adjusted for these factors, wages and salaries are below pre-pandemic levels. My constituents are pleading with Congress to focus on this issue and are being ignored by the out-of-touch majority. To speak further on the previous question, I yield 3 minutes to the representative from Oklahoma. Oh, he's up there.
Without objection. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose the previous question so that we can immediately consider H.R. 6858. This administration has sent desperate requests for oil from oppressive regimes like Iran and Venezuela. It's past time the Biden administration start making those frantic calls to Oklahoma instead of OPEC, or even my friends in Texas instead of Tehran. Until that happens, gas prices will continue to soar and hardworking Americans will suffer. While Putin continues to wage war on Ukraine, exposing our dependence on Russian energy, Biden continues to wage war on our domestic oil and gas industry that provides sustainable, reliable energy to the American people. This week, Biden doubled down his attack by releasing a budget that includes an astonishing $45 billion in tax hikes on the American energy producers. 70% of goods in America are moved by trucks. An increase in gas prices will continue to be passed down on the food and products that all Americans buy. Let me be clear, Biden's energy policy is hurting all Americans and not just at the pump. Whether you like it or not, traditional energy powers our country. Oil and gas is essential to power our homes. And yes, it provides the energy to power electric vehicles. Biden's war on energy poses a threat to all of us. It's imperative that the federal government stop villainizing the industry that powers our world. Global energy markets are complicated, but one thing is certain. If policymakers continue to impose barriers on domestic energy production, prices will continue to rise. Therefore, we need to instill confidence in the industry that plays such a crucial role in our economy by restoring stability and consistency with policies that prioritize American energy production. Investors and business leaders make their decisions based not only on the policies debated and voted on in D.C., but also in the rhetoric from public officials. What happens in this chamber impacts businesses, but also what we go out and say on cable TV does also. Trust me, I was a business leader for 35 years. Today's political climate will directly influence future investment decisions, especially in heavily regulated industries like energy. The Biden administration has been sending mixed messages. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle say they're concerned about the high prices reflected by the weak oil and gas supply, but their actions tell a different story. They aggressively push a plan to crush oil and gas production entirely. Their video simply doesn't match their audio, which is why the American people have lost faith in Democratic leadership. We must restore sanity and pursue energy dominance once again on the world stage. I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves, and the gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple points in response. One, we're trying to bring down the price of insulin. That's one of the bills here that we're talking about. From outrageous amounts that are required for this life-saving drug down to $35, yet my Republican colleagues oppose reducing that. They worry about the inflation at the pump, which we all do, but it's Putin's price hike. We know where this came from, this increase, and the president is working to release millions of barrels of oil from our underground storage. He wants to place a price on leases that aren't being used. We have 12 million acres that are under lease and are not being used. That will bring down the price at the pump, but we've got to defeat Putin. It's his price hike. I want to yield 5.5 minutes to the chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern, for his remarks.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I want to rise today to recognize someone who has made a truly exceptional contribution to this institution and to the work that goes on here, the amazing Peggy Fields. Peggy has served in the clerk's office since 2008, first as assistant bill clerk and now as bill clerk, where she oversees an amazing team that works late nights and long hours to literally keep the House of Representatives running. I could spend hours talking about how incredible everyone in the clerk's office is, how they have an incredible eye for detail and never drop the ball, how they seamlessly process the hundreds of daily submissions into the hopper, how they rose to the challenge of keeping this body running during a pandemic, implementing proxy voting and the e-hopper so our work could go on even when it wasn't safe for all of us to be here. And of course, how much they believe in this institution and all that it represents. But I only have a few minutes, so let me just say to everyone in the clerk's office that your work does not go unnoticed. It is recognized by so many of us here in the congressional community and beyond. Mr. Speaker, Peggy Fields started her journey to Capitol Hill 33 years ago when she went to work for former Congressman Bud Kramer, who was then the district attorney of Madison County, Alabama. Congressman Kramer told me that when he was sworn into Congress in January 1991, the first employee in his Washington office was Peggy Fields. Peggy helped run that office for 18 years, and unsurprisingly, she was beloved by everyone. In the congressman's office, Peggy proudly represented her hometown of Huntsville, Alabama. He told me that Peggy and her family are renowned in Huntsville and that she is and always has been devoted to the people of Huntsville, as well as her friends and family back home. In 2008, she joined the office of the clerk as an assistant bill clerk, and her dedication and exceptional work ethic earned her the promotion to bill clerk in July of 2021. As if all this were not enough, Peggy will soon graduate from Wesley Theological Seminary with a doctorate of ministry degree in church leadership, and I want to congratulate her on that incredible achievement. Peggy and her team have the daunting task of processing every single bill and co-sponsor form for the House. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, the bill clerks work especially closely with the parliamentarian's office because the parliamentarian is responsible for referring all bills on the day that they are introduced, and the bill clerks process those referrals on the same day as well. Now, sometimes that means that the bill clerks and parliamentarians share late nights together, and they get to know each other quite well. I want to read a note sent over to me by the parliamentarian's office about Peggy, and let me quote, "Peggy is always such a welcoming presence to us, both on the floor and in our offices. However, Peggy is so welcoming and kind that there is always a noticeable uptick in bill introduction whenever she is stationed on the floor. That's why we came to know her by the nickname, the Bill Magnet. And we know that our workload increases whenever she's on the floor. However, always thinking of others, Peggy would make up for this increased bill count by singing a cappella renditions of popular songs in our office while we finished up our referrals. She's one of a kind, the consummate public servant, and truly irreplaceable to this institution," end quote. Mr. Speaker, at a time when there are a lot of challenges and uncertainties in the world, here is someone who is doing everything she can to make everyone's day a little bit brighter and to give back to her community and to her country. Someone who, through her dogged willpower, incredible knowledge, and decades of experience, tackles every challenge she faces with poise, talent, and a great sense of humor. Even on her team's busiest days, during their longest hours, and on the latest nights, and during the historic and often unprecedented times that we are living through, Peggy is a beacon of light, bringing camaraderie and positivity to everything she does. She has served this institution and the people it represents with integrity, with honor, and with skill for the past 33 years. Mr. Speaker, Peggy Fields is an inspiration, and her career in public service has been nothing short of remarkable. She set out to make a difference, and what a difference she has made. On behalf of all of my colleagues and staff on both sides of the aisle, past and present, and the countless people in whose lives Peggy has made an immeasurable difference, I would like to extend this institution's deepest and most sincere thanks to Peggy and wish her all the best as she begins this new chapter. Thank you, Peggy.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I join the gentleman from Massachusetts and the entire body in congratulating Ms. Fields on her retirement and thank her for her service. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the previous question so that we can immediately consider H.R. 6858, the American Energy Independence from Russia Act. As Congress debates legalizing marijuana, Americans in the real world are facing an energy crisis that we in Congress cannot afford to continue to ignore. In my hometown of Altoona, Pennsylvania, the cost of gasoline is now $4.28 a gallon, over 50% higher than it was just 1 year ago. In rural communities, these skyrocketing prices are forcing families to make hard choices about what they can afford and what they cannot afford. Instead of working to support the needs of these Pennsylvanian families, President Biden and his administration have continued to work against American energy producers. On day one of his presidency, President Biden made good on a long-time liberal wish list item. He canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, in his budget, President Biden has chosen to put solar panels ahead of natural gas. He has chosen to put windmills ahead of coal. He has chosen the Green New Deal ahead of Pennsylvanians. Now, the president has decided to recklessly release oil from our strategic reserves without a concrete plan to refill that. This stopgap measure does not support our national security, and it will do little to help lower the cost of fuel for American families. It is time to invest in American energy. It is time to return to American energy dominance. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question. Thank you, and I yield.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. We're here in terms of reducing prices on insulin, something that so many Americans need, yet my colleagues want to talk about a bill that's not even before the House of Representatives today. We ought to be talking about reducing the price of prescription drugs like insulin for Americans who need it. I'm going to yield 2 minutes to my friend, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, another prominent member of the Rules Committee.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Perlmutter. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of today's rule. The two bills in the rule provide for important, long overdue reforms that most Americans are in favor of. The MORE Act will reform our federal drug laws to bring federal laws in line with the majority of states which are now legally and responsibly regulating cannabis. 37 states, including the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, have successfully legalized medicinal cannabis, creating a thriving, safe, and legal market for cannabis, creating thousands of jobs and billions in new tax revenue. This is a rare win-win scenario for everyone: government, businesses, patients, and consumers. However, the ongoing conflict between our state and federal laws creates daily legal issues for businesses, banks, doctors, and consumers. The MORE Act will address these problems by removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. This will allow veterans to use medicinal cannabis without losing their VA benefits. It will allow legal businesses to access financial services. It will allow scientists and government agencies to research cannabis. And it will not prevent states from regulating or even criminalizing misuse of cannabis. More importantly, the MORE Act includes a comprehensive package of criminal justice reforms to give a second chance to those whose lives have been upended by the excesses of the war on drugs. Mr. Speaker, today's rule also includes the Affordable Insulin Now Act, which will cap insulin costs at $35. This is a much-needed reform that will provide financial relief to the millions of Americans who rely on insulin to manage their diabetes. While I'm glad that we're able to find compromise on capping insulin costs, Americans are demanding that we pass comprehensive legislation to lower prescription drug costs for all Americans, and we continue to invite our Republican colleagues to help us to do that. Prescription drug prices are way too high. Insulin is 10 times more expensive in the U.S. than in other countries. Across the board, Americans pay more for their drugs than people in other countries pay for the exact same drugs. There's no justification for this difference. 30 seconds?
I'd yield the lady 30 more seconds, please.
Thank you. There's no justification for this difference. The prescription drug market is broken, and insulin is just one example of how bad the problem is. We urgently need prescription drug price reform so all Americans can afford the medications they need to manage their health. I urge all my colleagues to vote for today's rule and the underlying bills when they're considered on the floor. Thank you.
The reserve.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Colorado.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you to the gentlewoman from Minnesota. I rise today to urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so that we can immediately consider the American Energy Independence from Russia Act. Gas prices are at $5 and even $6 a gallon. The average household is now spending $2,000 more a year because of increased gas costs on Biden's watch. Biden and the Democrats think now is the time to add $45 billion in new taxes on the oil and gas industry. Many Americans have been and are being regulated into poverty in an unnecessary sacrifice at the altar of climate change. Instead of unleashing our domestic oil and gas industry, Biden has simped to radical environmentalists and not in my backyard extremists and literally begged OPEC to drill more oil instead of relying on the hardworking American roughneck. On day one, he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, killing 11,000 good-paying American energy jobs. But that didn't stop the big guy from approving the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and benefiting our enemies. Because of Biden's fake ban on Russian oil and gas that won't even go into effect for 22 more days and is littered with waivers to keep Russian energy flowing, the U.S. continues to import 100,000 barrels of Russian oil and send them roughly $10 million each day. We, folks, are funding the Kremlin. Why does Biden favor foreign energy over domestic energy? We know that American natural gas is 42% cleaner than Russian gas. So it's not for environmental reasons, but maybe there's another reason we don't know about. Perhaps there's 10% in this tucked away for the big guy. How about this? Instead of funding both sides of the war and playing Biden and Pelosi's con game, we should restart construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, overturn Biden's energy leasing moratorium, and expedite permits for pipelines and natural gas exports. We need the American Energy Independence from Russia Act and stop playing Biden's energy from anywhere from America game. Mr. Speaker, America should not only have affordable energy for our own use, but we should be exporting it abroad. We can literally export strength and freedom to our allies. In short, the solution is very simple. Drill, baby, drill. And I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 90 seconds, 1.5 minutes, to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And still I rise, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the richest country in the world, we cannot allow health care to become wealth care, available to those who can afford it. Mr. Speaker, this is why I support H.R. 6833, the Affordable Insulin Now Act, because diabetes can kill and insulin can save lives if you can get it. Some things bear repeating. Insulin saves lives if you can get it. Mr. Speaker, this bill will ensure that millions who need it will be able to get it. In the richest country in the world, Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow health care to be wealth care. I yield back the balance of my time.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
And Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the previous question so that we can immediately consider H.R. 6858, the American Energy Independence from Russia Act. Just 1 year ago, our country was comfortably meeting our energy needs, and we were a net exporter of energy for the first time in 50 years. However, under the Biden administration, we have seen a continued assault on American energy that has killed jobs, increased our dependency on foreign energy sources, and most recently, jeopardized our national security. The administration continues to block new oil and gas lease sales from moving forward, all while placing undue regulatory burdens on American energy development. Just this week, President Biden proposed $45 billion worth of tax increases on fossil fuels in his budget to further weaken America's ability to power our country. These proposed tax increases are just another example of the administration doubling down on the anti-American produced energy policies that have sent prices skyrocketing here at home. The administration's energy agenda has not only undermined our country's energy security, but has also forced our European allies to become even more dependent on Russia to meet their energy needs. Instead of turning to America's own energy sector to meet our energy needs, this administration is asking countries like Iran and Venezuela to compensate for the ban on Russian imports and ignoring America's energy producers. In doing so, they are prioritizing oil produced by dictators over American energy producers who support jobs and businesses here at home. The administration must reverse course and stop depending on foreign dictators to ship oil to the United States. Mr. Speaker, now is the time to flip the switch and reduce our dependence on foreign energy by unleashing American energy. I urge a no vote on the previous question, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman. Oh, I'm wrong. Sorry. I'm sorry. I reserve. I was ahead of myself. Look at that. So excited. Maybe I'm have too much caffeine.
Yes, we're both getting
I'm
ahead
sorry,
of
Mr.
ourselves
Speaker.
today.
The gentlewoman
Mr. Speaker, I'd
reserves.
like
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you. Could I inquire how much time each side has, please?
The gentleman from Colorado has 10 minutes remaining. And the gentlewoman from Minnesota has 13 and a half minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Affordable Insulin Now Act and the underlying rule. It is unconscionable that in the richest country on the planet that our planet's ever seen, millions of Americans, our neighbors, are forced to choose between buying medicine and paying their gas bill. Americans pay more than 10 times the price of insulin compared to other similar countries. 10 times. In fact, 1 in 4 of our neighbors who rely on insulin have rationed or skipped doses due to the cost. And I want folks to think about that. 1/4 of the people prescribed insulin for their medical condition have risked their life to be able to afford another month's worth of insulin. This is shameful, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 6833 caps out-of-pocket costs for insulin at no more than $35 per month in Medicare and commercial health insurance. This cap will be a lifesaver for millions of our neighbors who currently pay, again, 10 times more the price of insulin compared, again, to similar wealthy nations. How can these companies sell the exact same drug here for 10 times the price of other nations? Because corporate greed and price gouging are not just permitted in our country, but encouraged. The bill is not the complete fix, Mr. Speaker, and we must do more to help our uninsured and so many who are hurt and getting sicker and even dying because of corporate greed and monopolies of big pharma. This bill, again, is the beginning in reining in corporate greed and putting people over profits. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I've got it right this time. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Representative Fischbach. Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose the previous question so we can immediately consider H.R. 6858, the American Energy Independence from Russia Act. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill, which will strengthen our energy security, bolster our economy, and position ourselves to counter Russian aggression in Ukraine. This morning, gas near my district office in Ogden, Utah, is $4.30. For the average family driving the average vehicle in Utah, this means that each fill-up will cost over $110. For Utah's hardworking agricultural industry, this means thousands of dollars more will be spent on fuels so they can feed the rest of America. These skyrocketing prices are unacceptable, and I share my constituents' outrage over how the Biden administration's policies have contributed to this painful situation. This is a self-imposed tax on all Americans. For those of us that have come from energy-producing states, we know we can do better. It's past time we get back to what we were doing in 2019 when the United States was a net exporter of energy. It's better for our economy and our environment when we produce domestically. In Utah, we understand this because we do this. Instead of allowing Americans to do their jobs, the Biden administration has shut down new oil and gas leasing. Instead of helping our communities grow, he has asked the oil cartels in the Middle East to pump more oil. Instead of investing in America, he has made us more dependent on energy imports from Russia and other foreign adversaries. We can do better. Passing the American Energy Independence from Russia Act today will put us on a path toward energy independence. I encourage my colleagues to join me in rejecting the previous question so we can lower prices for all, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman is recognized.
I support this bill's relief for Mary Ann Austin, whose grandson, like so many others, will be able to get some relief, paying up to $300 per month for insulin. Now they would pay $35 per month. But 5.5 million Texans and 28 million Americans are uninsured. This bill offers them no help whatsoever. In our upside-down healthcare system, those who have the least continually get asked to pay the most for essential pharmaceuticals. 68% of those without health insurance are forced to pay full monopoly prices for their essential insulin. They're being denied any relief today, despite the fact that I and 12 of my colleagues offered a simple amendment that could have provided that assistance. Nor does this bill represent the slightest progress toward preventing prescription price gouging. It is so true, as many have said, that many Americans are paying 10 times the price for insulin as do consumers in other countries. This bill does not do anything, however, to lower it to 9 times. Indeed, this bill does not lower the price of insulin by 1 penny. It just shifts the burden of paying for the insulin off of the shoulders of insured insulin users and shifts it on to the rest of all of us who are paying insurance premiums and will pay higher premiums because of this, and $11 billion more in cost to the taxpayers. I assume Big Pharma supports this bill because it's not facing any additional duty to lower its prices for this life-saving product. Someday, this Congress will break free of the shackles of Big Pharma, which fills these halls with more lobbyists than there are members of Congress. Someday we will provide genuine relief to all Americans burdened by soaring drug prices, but that day, sadly, is not today. I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Chairman, I rise to oppose the previous question so that we can immediately consider H.R. 6858, the American Energy Independence from Russia Act. That would not only strengthen our security and independence, it would lower gas prices by approving the Keystone Pipeline, removing restrictions on LNG exports, restarting production on federal lands and water, and overall encouraging more American energy development. In the midst of skyrocketing inflation and surging prices at the pump, along with the geopolitical context where Europe is dependent on Russia oil and gas, you would think the Biden administration would abandon their whole-of-government approach to targeting American energy production. Since Biden took office, he's used every tool at his disposal to undermine the oil and gas industry and our energy independence along with it. In addition to the onslaught of his unilateral attacks, his first presidential budget was released and called for $35 billion in punitive tax increases on the oil and gas industry. And his administration has weaponized and abused their regulatory authority to attack the industry at every turn. SEC reports, FERC permitting, OMB directives, EPA radical regulations. But what's more astonishing is Biden's latest budget, which is $4 trillion in taxes, includes $45 billion in taxes on oil and gas. These are the same provisions that his own party rejected and had to abandon their Build Back Broke proposal. So just like he's done with the regulatory regime, it appears our president's weaponizing the tax code to cancel an entire sector of our economy, one that is paramount to our prosperity and security. As events around the world constrain supply, he seems hell-bent to ensure that anyone but American energy producers, the most efficient, cleanest producers in the world, are positioned to supply the United States and our people and our allies around the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you. I'd remind my friend, Mr. Erickson, that There are 12 million acres of non-producing federal land with 9,000 unused but already approved permits for production. I'd also like to wish him a happy birthday. With that, I'll yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman very much, and I rise to support H.R. 6833 at the beginning, and I acknowledge Ms. Craig and Ms. McBath. I tell my friends on the other side of the aisle that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but right now people are dying because they are apportioning or putting in proportion their insulin that they need, not taking the full amount, but doing it proportionately. That's a death sentence. Let me indicate Native Americans, 14.7% diabetic, Hispanic, 12.5%, Black Americans, 11.7%. Many of them on Medicare, many of them on Medicaid. We can do both, but I do rise to support this legislation, $35 in 2023, regardless of whether a beneficiary has reached the annual out-of-pocket spending, $35 beginning in 2024. It is well known that those who had diabetes suffered more with COVID-19. This is an important step. But in my district, the 18th Congressional District, uninsured residents pay 23 times more for the brand of insulin, and we must begin to work on that. I join with my colleagues in making that the next steps. I rise for this. But I also rise to support the new response to marijuana and to insist that we pass the MORE Act. Came out of my subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee. Thank you to Mr. Nadler. Public support for legalization of marijuana has surged in the past 2 decades. A total of 47 states have reformed their laws. We must reform the banking aspect of it. We need to open the door to research, therapeutic treatment for veterans, better banking and tax laws, and we need to help fuel the economic growth within the industry. We need to do this by sending dollars out to help our respective communities, bring down the cost of crime, be able to help those who are in business. We must do this and spend federal resources to end criminalization, build the economic engine, and to ensure that we are in step with 47 of our states. Thousands of men and women have suffered needlessly from the federal criminalization of marijuana with mandatory minimums, particularly black and brown. So all these persons incarcerated need to be able to be constructive, but they're in there on the false war on drugs. I support both the insulin bill and the MORE Act, and I ask my colleagues to support the underlying rule. With that, I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American people should be asking, no, they should be demanding that this body address energy independence. But the majority refuses to hear or even discuss the Republican solution that we've been talking about. But instead, we do have before us today the bill to legalize pot. And with that, I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, the lady from Minnesota, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the MORE legislation, both for what it does and what it does not do. For starters, the bill authorizes the collection of detailed demographic information on marijuana sector employees, including their race and ethnicity, for a massive, publicly accessible government database. This is another attempt by Democrats to promote their destructive identity politics agenda and lay the groundwork for a rigid quota system that picks winners and losers based on skin color. The database will also put more sensitive personal data at risk and open the door to mischief by federal bureaucrats who have repeatedly weaponized access to Americans' private information to promote a partisan political agenda. Hello, IRS. I am also disappointed that the majority refused to allow votes on 2 common-sense amendments I proposed. The first would have required child-resistant packaging and a Surgeon General's warning label detailing the danger these products pose to pregnant women and their unborn babies. Investigative reports have revealed multiple instances of pot shop clerks recommending marijuana to expectant mothers as safe, despite well-documented risks. Few, if any, of these retail clerks have any medical training and should stick to dispensing pot, not prenatal advice. The second would have banned the use of ingredients or flavor additives in marijuana-infused products such as fruit, chocolate, vanilla, or candy. For years, we have been told by many on the other side that such flavors appeal to children and should be banned from tobacco products. If this standard is good enough for Juul and Puff Bar, shouldn't it also apply to Cheech and Chong? Mr. Speaker, this legislation will make an already complicated situation worse. I ask for a no vote and a no vote on the bill. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you. And I just remind my friend from Wisconsin, 47 states, every territory, and the District of Columbia now allow for some level of marijuana use, and this Congress is going to have to catch up to what the states are doing. With that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Ms. Pelosi.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his leadership in bringing this important legislation to the floor. Mr. Speaker, in his outstanding State of the Union address earlier this month, President Joe Biden presented Democrats' visionary agenda to build a better America with lower health care costs for American families, and with justice in all that we do. House Democrats have long led the charge to lower the cost of prescription drugs. So it's great pride that the Democratic House today will advance one of the pillars of this vision, capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month. And in doing so, we take another important step in the fight to bring down drug prices across the board for every American family. Thank you to the lead sponsors of this legislation who have been relentless, dissatisfied, and persistent in this fight, Congresswoman Angie Craig, Congressman Dan Kildee, and Congresswoman Lucy McBath of Georgia. And I salute the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction for helping steer this vital legislation to the floor. Chairman Frank Pallone of Energy and Commerce, Chairman Richie Neal of Ways and Means, and Chairman Bobby Scott of Education and Labor. Everyone knows that the cost of insulin, a life-saving drug that has been around for a century, is outrageous and out of control. That cost is outrageous and out of control. On average, Americans pay more than 10 times for insulin compared to what consumers around the world pay. Here in the United States, the price of insulin skyrocketed by 54% from 2014 to 2019. Meanwhile, Big Pharma is reaping record-breaking profits, producing insulin at about $10 a vial while charging families up to 30 times that amount. And this affordability crisis is taking a severe human toll. 1 in 4 Americans who rely on insulin have been forced to ration or skip their dose, a practice that can be dangerous and even deadly. And working parents and a family member on insulin are reporting higher levels of stress and anxiety, often forced to choose between paying their bills or protecting the health of a loved one. Indeed, across the country, as I've said on this floor before, I have seen grown men cry about how they cannot meet their family needs when it comes to prescription drugs. This crisis is a kitchen table issue for millions of families, and it is a medical, economic, and moral imperative that Congress take action. The Affordable Insulin Now Act not only requires Medicare and commercial users to cover life-saving insulin on their plans, but also caps the out-of-pocket cost for families at $35 per month. In doing so, we put more money back in the pockets of hardworking families and vulnerable seniors. This is crucial right now, as so many Americans struggle to keep up with the burdensome everyday cost. And of course, this has even been exacerbated with COVID, which has, in many instances, spread diabetes more. House Democrats proudly passed a cap on insulin's cost in the Build Back Better legislation last year. We already did this last year. And today, we again take this strong step toward lower cost for the people. To be clear, comprehensive reform is urgently needed to lift the crushing burden of prescription drug prices weighing on our families. Democrats will never relent, Mr. Speaker, until we realize our longstanding goal of lowering drug prices across the board. And we are continuing our fight to empower Medicare to negotiate for lower drug prices. We've been working on that for decades, and make these lower prices available to Americans with private insurance, too. We do so in honor of the late Chairman Elijah Cummings, the North Star of our Congress, and a relentless warrior for lower drug prices with the Lower Drug Cost Now Act. Mr. Speaker, as you know, this rule applies not just to lowering the cost of insulin, but also to the very important MORE Act. I rise today in support of this urgent legislation that will help pave the path toward racial and economic justice. Thank you, Chairman Jerry Nadler, for being steadfast voice for equity and opportunity for all at the helm of the Judiciary Committee. Let us salute Congressman Ed Perlmutter for your tireless and long-standing leadership on this issue. Relentless, persistent, dissatisfied, as you say. Thank heaven for passing it today. I also want to commend Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congressman Earl Blumenauer for their persistence as well. For far too long, Mr. Speaker, failed federal drug policies have torn apart families and devastated communities of color. People of color are 4 times more likely to be arrested on cannabis charges and are often targeted for longer prison terms than others. Tragically, the communities most harmed by criminalization are benefiting the least from legal cannabis marketplace, as prior cannabis convictions are barring too many of them from entering the industry. As a result, only 1/5 of cannabis businesses are minority-owned, and only 4% of owners are Black. Meanwhile, more than 600,000 Americans are still arrested each year on cannabis charges, threatening to perpetuate this vicious cycle. With the MORE Act, which the Democratic House proudly passed last Congress, we take strong actions to correct these injustices. This landmark legislation is one of the most important criminal justice reform bills in recent history, delivering justice for those harmed by the brutal, unfair consequences of decriminalization, opening the doors of opportunity for all to participate in this rapidly growing industry, and decriminalizing cannabis at the federal level so we do not repeat the grave mistakes of our past. Those of us from California take pride in our state's long leadership in this justice effort, and in recent years, 46 more states have reformed cannabis laws, as the distinguished gentleman from Colorado mentioned in his remarks. 47 states have taken this act. Now it is time for the federal government to follow suit. Both of the bills that the House will pass today that are covered by this rule, the Insulin bill and this MORE Act, are overwhelmingly popular with the American people, and they represent strong steps toward building a brighter, fairer future for our children. With that, I urge strong bipartisan yes votes on both bills and on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Minnesota.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a law enforcement officer for over 23 years, I have had to make the devastating visit to unsuspecting family members to tell them that their loved one has died because a driver who was driving under the influence. We can all sit here and pretend that marijuana is a harmless drug, but it is not. It clouds your judgment and inhibits your reaction time. The unfortunate reality is, if we take steps to legalize, we will without question increase the number of people who will drive under the influence of marijuana on our roads. As we know all too well, there are many angel families in this country that have lost their sons and daughters to people who were unlawfully in this country and drove under the influence.
My amendment would have ensured the MORE Act does not prohibit the deportation of illegal immigrants who are convicted of driving under the influence of marijuana. Unfortunately, Democrats blocked my common sense and potentially life-saving amendment. Mr. Speaker, shouldn't we, at a minimum, ensure this legislation is not weaponized and used as a tool to get criminals who are in this country illegally out of trouble and out of deportation proceedings? It seems to me that the safety of the American people continues to be a low priority for this Democrat majority. I ask my colleagues to vote no on the rule. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I'd like to ask my friend from Minnesota if she has any other speakers.
No, we do not. I am prepared to close if you'd like.
Please.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to be disappointed in the priorities of my colleagues. They have chosen to spend precious time that could be spent addressing the national debt, inflation, gas prices, or any number of serious issues facing Americans today. Instead, they chose to talk about legalizing marijuana and spending tax dollars on pot stores, which does not take into consideration important elements like how to protect minors or how to address laws surrounding driving under the influence, and an insincere attempt to address the rising cost of insulin. Mr. Speaker, I oppose the rule and the underlying bills, and I ask members to do the same. And with that, Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman from Colorado has 3 minutes.
I yield myself the remainder of my time. I want to thank my colleagues for joining me here today to speak on the rule, the MORE Act, and the Affordable Insulin Now Act. I especially want to thank Mr. Nadler, Ms. Lee, Mr. Blumenauer with respect to the MORE Act. Data is clear that patients in the United States pay more than 10 times for their insulin than what patients in other countries pay for this life-saving drug. There are reports of people paying up to $1,000 a month just to keep themselves alive. Nobody should face these kinds of difficult decisions about affording their medication and keeping themselves healthy or putting food on the table. The Affordable Insulin Now Act puts a reasonable cap of $35 a month on this important drug, and I hope we can advance this bipartisan idea this week. On marijuana, we are long past due for the reforms in the MORE Act. The MORE Act is about justice, safety, equity, and states' rights. We must decriminalize marijuana at the federal level and take meaningful steps to address the effects the war on drugs have had, particularly in minority and disadvantaged communities. To my friends on the other side of the aisle who claim this isn't an important issue to American families, I encourage them to talk to individuals who can't pass a background check to get a job, to visit with people who spent time in prison for a low-level marijuana conviction whose lives have been changed forever, talk to a state legal business owner or employee who faces armed robberies and threats of violence due to all the cash they have since a business can't access the banking system. The House is acting again this week to urge the Senate to finally pass meaningful cannabis reform legislation. As this body knows, my Safe Banking Act has passed the House 6 times now without any Senate action, with big bipartisan numbers. The House will pass the MORE Act this week. It is clear Congress needs to reform our broken cannabis laws to better respond to the 47 states across the country who have some level of marijuana use. With that, Mr. Speaker, I encourage a yes vote on the rule and the previous question. I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mrs. Mace of South Carolina, Mrs. Mace will vote no on 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mrs. Lisa McLean of Michigan, 10th District, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mrs. McLean will vote no on H.R. 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Krishnamurthy of Illinois, Mr. Trone of Maryland, Ms. Manning of North Carolina, Ms. Newman of Illinois, and Mr. Swazi of New York, I inform the House that these 5 members will vote yes on ordering the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
As a member designated by Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, Chairman Scott, and Representative Wilson, I inform the House that these members will vote yea on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
As the member designated by Jamal Bowman, I inform the House that he will vote yes on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Salazar of Florida, I inform the House that Ms. Salazar will vote nay on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Adriano Espaillat, I inform the House that Adriano Espaillat will vote yes on the previous question.
Purpose does a gentlewoman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Baird of Indiana, I inform the House that Mr. Baird of Indiana will vote no on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Michelle Steele of California pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congresswoman Steele will vote no on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Bilirakis of Florida, I inform the House that Mr. Bilirakis will vote nay on the previous question. And Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Comer of Kentucky, I inform the House that Mr. Comer will vote nay on the previous question. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Kahele, I inform the House that Mr. Kahele will vote yea on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated for Mr. Owens and Mr. Curtis from Utah, I inform the House that Mr. Owens and Mr. Curtis will vote nay on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Delaware seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Gett of Colorado, I inform the House that this member will vote yes on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member designated by Mr. Thompson of Mississippi, I inform the House that he will vote yea on H.R. Resolution 1012.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Albio Series, I inform the House that Mr. Series will vote yes on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Cawthorn, North Carolina, I inform the House that Mr. Cawthorn will vote no on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Waltz of the state of Florida, I inform the House that Mr. Waltz will vote nay on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As the member designated by Representatives Harder, Sanchez, and Jayapal, I inform the House that these members will vote aye on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Christ, Lawson, and Soto of Florida, and Ms. Roybal Allard of California, I inform the House that these members will vote yea on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Marilyn Strickland, I inform the House that Ms. Strickland will vote yes on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Hampshire?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Mr. Cuellar, I inform the House that Mr. Cuellar will vote yes on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Taylor of Texas, I inform the House that the member will vote no on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member designated by Mr. Pete Sessions of Texas, I inform the House that this member will vote nay on the previous question.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Joyce of Ohio, I inform the House that Mr. Joyce will vote nay on the previous question.
On this vote, the yeas are 219 and the nays are 202. The previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker. Mr.
The
Speaker.
gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote. And I hit this, right? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Delaware seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. DeGette of Colorado, I inform the House that Ms. DeGette will vote yes on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Waltz of the state of Florida, I inform the House that Mr. Waltz will vote nay on the rule.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Swazi of New York, Ms. Manning of North Carolina, Ms. Newman of Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy of Illinois, and Mr. Trone of Maryland, I inform the House that these 5 members will vote yes on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Baird of Indiana, I inform the House that Mr. Baird will vote no on the present rule. No on the rule.
does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
As the member designated by Jamal Bowman, I inform the House that he will vote yes on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Madam Speaker, as a measure designated by Michelle Steele of California, I inform the House that Congresswoman Steele will vote no on the rule.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Hampshire rise?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Cuellar, I inform the House that Mr. Cuellar will vote yes on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Taylor of Texas, Mr. Taylor will vote no on the previous on 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
As a member designated by Representatives Harder, Sanchez, and Jayapal, I inform the House that these members will vote aye on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Yes, ma'am. Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Pete Sessions of the state of Texas, I inform the House that Mr. Sessions will vote nay on the rule.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Representative Marilyn Strickland, I inform the House that Ms. Strickland will vote yes on House Resolution 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Bilirakis of Florida, I inform the House that Mr. Bilirakis will vote nay on the rule. And Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Comer of Kentucky, I inform the House that Mr. Comer will vote nay on the rule. Thank you.
What purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
As the member designated Mr. Cahaly, I inform the House that Mr. Cahaly will vote yes on H.R. 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah rise?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated for Mr. Owens and Mr. Curtis from Utah, I inform the House that Mr. Owens and Mr. Curtis will vote nay on the rule.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Madam Speaker, as member designated by Adriano Espaillat, I inform the House that Mr. Espaillat will vote yes on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the member designated by Ms. Salazar of Florida, I inform the House that Ms. Salazar will vote nay on the rule.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida rise?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Christ, Lawson, and Soto of Florida, and Ms. Roybal Allard of California, I inform the House that these members will vote yea on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin rise?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Lisa McClain of Michigan's 10th District pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Ms. McClain will vote no on H.R. 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
As a member designated by Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, Chairman Scott, and Representative Wilson, I inform the House these members will vote yea on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Joyce of Ohio, I inform the House that Mr. Joyce will vote nay on the rule.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Albio Series, I inform the House that Mr. Series will vote yes on H-Res 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
As a member designated by Mr. Cawthorn, North Carolina, I inform the House that Mr. Cawthorn will vote no on the rule.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Thompson of Mississippi, I'm on the House that Mr. Thompson votes yes on 1017.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
As the member designated by Mrs. Mace of South Carolina, Mrs. Mace will vote no on 1017.
On this vote, the yeas are 219 and the nays are 202. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members will remove their conversations from the House floor. The House will come to order. Members will remove their conversations from the House floor. The House will come to order. Members will please remove their conversations from the House floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 1017, I call up H.R. 6833 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 6833, a bill to amend Title 27 of the Public Health Service Act, the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, and the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 to establish requirements with respect to cost sharing for certain insulin products and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1017, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-38, modified via the amendment printed in Part C, House Report 117-285, is adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill as amendment shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided among and controlled by the respective chairs and ranking members of the Committees on Education and Labor, Energy and Commerce, and Ways and Means, or their respective designees. The gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, the gentlewoman from Washington, Mrs. Rogers, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, and the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, will each control 10 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and add extraneous material on H.R. 6833.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Affordable Insulin Now Act, which is critical to protecting more than 7 million American patients who rely on insulin. Today, 1 in 4 Americans who need insulin report either having cut back or skipped doses because the cost is simply too high. That is heartbreaking and unacceptable. No one should have to ration their insulin to help reduce costs and risk their health, and in some cases actually cost them their lives. This bill will make insulin more affordable by capping the out-of-pocket costs for consumers in both Medicare and the private insurance market at $35 a month. This will address the vast disparities between what people pay for insulin in other countries as compared to the United States. Right now, Americans are paying more than 10 times the price for insulin as people in other high-income countries, and that's simply not fair. Right now, 1 out of every 5 Americans who depend on insulin have out-of-pocket costs of significantly more than $35 per month, and that is unconscionable considering that this has been in use. Insulin has been in use for over a century. Now, I've heard my Republican colleagues contend that prices for insulin are coming down. But in reality, prices are going up for the consumer. The list prices set by the manufacturer and which patient cost sharing is based off of keep going up. In fact, reports note that the average retail price for insulin rose 54%, more than double, from 2014 to 2019. Now, Madam Speaker, I continue to strongly support comprehensive efforts to rein in the soaring costs of prescription drugs, and empowering Medicare to negotiate fair prices. But we cannot afford to wait any longer to address the price of insulin. I want to commend Representatives Craig, Kildee, and McBath for their leadership and hard work in bringing this important legislation to the House floor. I urge my colleagues on a bipartisan basis to support this life-saving legislation. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Washington, Mrs. Rogers, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We all share the goal of reducing the cost of insulin. This bill, however, is not the right answer. This is an attempt to revive Speaker Pelosi's proposed government drug pricing scheme, part of a socialized medicine approach that would lead to fewer cures. It's the largest expansion of the federal government's role in private health insurance design since Obamacare. It will cost more than $11 billion over the next 10 years through higher subsidies for higher premiums. Just this morning, Axios reported, quote, legislation like the House bill from Representative Angie Craig that will be debated on the floor wouldn't address the core problem of rising cost of insulin. It would instead shift more cost onto health insurers and employers and result in higher premiums, according to experts. That means people who can't afford day-to-day life because of inflation and spending will face higher costs someplace else. Today, it's the government fixing the price on insulin. What's next? Gas? Food? History tells us that price fixing doesn't work. It shifts the problem someplace else. So the powerful has the excuse for more subsidies, more spending, and more control. This bill does nothing to address the real reasons insulin prices are going up. One of those is that pharmacy benefit managers and other middlemen who negotiate for high list price and then hide the lower cost from the patients. This bill gives the middlemen who are making the money a pass. Because again, in this bill, the Democrats delayed the rebate rule that would ensure that the real savings go into the pockets of the patients. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a solution. We have a bill that we've been working on for several Congresses. It enjoys bipartisan support. It's H.R. 19, the Lower Costs, Lower Cures Act. It would lower the cost of all prescription drugs, including insulin. It caps seniors' out-of-pocket insulin cost at $50 per month through Medicare. It also allows high deductible plans to cover insulin before the deductible kicks in. It increases low-cost options with more generic and biosimilar competition. There is exciting innovation on the way, being built right now, and it creates more price transparency. We should be lowering the cost without going down the road of price controls that destroy the hope of so many people in this country for life-saving cures. I urge us to reject H.R. 6388. Let's work on a solution for patients for all diseases. Thank you. I yield back. I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield now 1 minute to our Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer, who, along with the rest of the leadership, continues this effort to address affordability.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, the gentlelady from California, and I thank the gentleman and the chairman of the committee. And I want to rise, first of all, this is not price control. It's limiting the purchaser on a price, but the companies are still going to charge what they're going to charge, and somebody's going to have to pay, and Medicare is going to have to pay. So it does increase the cost, but it's not price control on the pharmaceuticals. And I want to say that we have a bill, of course, that will allow negotiation in Medicare, just as the VA does. Negotiation is not price control. Negotiation is saying, I'm going to buy a lot of your product and I want a better price. A lot of us do that. We call it Sam's Club or some other club that we go to, and we buy large volumes and get a cheaper price than our poorer friends who just buy it one at a time. So I'm for this bill. It's a good bill. Madam Speaker, I want to thank Representatives Craig, Kildee, and McBath for their leadership on this bill. They have long been champions of making health care and prescription medications accessible and affordable for all Americans. More than 1 in 3 Americans are at high risk of developing diabetes, and over 37 million Americans have it. A lot of those folks can't do without it. They don't have an option. And insulin, which has been on the market for decades and is not protected under patent, and the development prices have long ages ago been amortized. To treat their condition, the people who have diabetes must rely on insulin injections to regulate their blood sugar levels. Now, if you have no option of not buying a product, those who sell that product can put the price wherever, if it means your life. A lack of insulin can lead to insulin shock, diabetes coma, kidney failure, and death. It's unacceptable that this life-saving medication is priced out of the reach for many who need it, because it costs so little to produce. This is not a mechanism that has to charge these prices because it took so much to produce it. It costs only $10 to manufacture a month's supply. Yet a month's supply can cost hundreds of dollars. However, with out-of-pocket costs as high as over $600 for a 40-day supply. Now, if you extrapolate 40 days, that's 10 days more than a month. So that's a third more. So let's say it costs $13 to produce. $600. Why? Because if they don't have it, they die. So all we're saying is, let's make sure this is affordable so people can sustain their lives and their health. Many Americans have resorted to rationing for skipping doses of their insulin because they can't afford it. The legislation before us would cap the out-of-pocket price of insulin of $35 a month. Let me again remind you, that's 350% of the cost of producing it. This would ease the burden of skyrocketing prices and impossible choices. Americans should not have to choose between paying rent, or food, or whatever, or paying for their insulin. As a matter of fact, they can't make that choice. They need both. They need to eat, and they need to live. And insulin is so often the way they assure that outcome. The prices will continue to rise unless we choose to act today. Madam Speaker, House Democrats already voted for this measure once, and Republicans already voted against it. So I guess we don't have any surprise of what's going to happen here. The Republicans are going to say to those who are using insulin, you're on your own. You're on your own. We're not going to worry about it. And we're going to say, we're here to help. We're here to make sure you don't get ripped off. We're here to make sure that you have the medicine that you absolutely need to survive. We voted for this measure as part of the Build Back Better Act in November. We made a promise to the American people that we would address the cost of prescription drugs, and we honored that price. Republicans said no. They said once again, consumer, you need insulin, you're on your own. They voted for higher drug prices. They voted for the status quo, where many Americans have to choose between life-saving insulin and putting food on the table. Today, my fellow colleagues, is an opportunity to vote to save lives and to provide a lifeline for millions of Americans with diabetes. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, do not say to the American people, you're on your own. Tell them we are here to help. Vote to help them. Vote to ensure that they will be able to afford a drug they need to protect themselves from death. My colleagues join me in voting to bring prices down across our economy and our healthcare system. Join me in protecting Americans' ability to access life-saving medication that prevents needless suffering, extends life, and provides a higher quality of living. Join me in voting for the Affordable Insulin for All bill. Again, I want to thank Ms. Craig, Mr. Kildee, Ms. McBath, the chairman of this committee, and all those who brought this bill to the floor, and urge my colleagues, don't say you're on your own. Say we're by your side and we're here to help. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Washington, Mrs. Rogers, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just remind the body that the measure that the majority leader referred to in committee, it failed in the Energy and Commerce Committee. Opposition from Democrats and Republicans, because the proposed capping, price fixing of drugs that the Democrats are promoting would jeopardize cures for people with Alzheimer's, cancers, diabetes. This bill does not bring down the cost. It only shifts the cost. And with that, and in fact, their definition of negotiation would allow the government to impose a 95% tax on the innovators. I now yield to the leader on Energy and Commerce Committee of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Brett Guthrie.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm proud to be here today. I worked with my colleague, Diana DeGette. We had hearings on the cost of diabetes, had all the supply chain, and we said this is something we can work on together, and we did work on it together, and most of those provisions are in a bipartisan H.R. 19, the Lower Cost, More Cures Act, because I'm fighting for my constituents to have lower insulin costs. But I think more importantly, I'm fighting for my constituents to deliver a cure for diabetes. There are experts that say it's not impossible to have a cure for diabetes in the next decade. And we need to continue to push policies that promote innovation, not slow it down. So the Lower Cost, More Cures Act would help patients, including seniors, afford monthly insulin prescriptions without discouraging future investments in breakthrough medications. I encourage the majority to come back with more cures, with H.R. 19, More Cures, Less Costs Act. And let's work together instead of just the rhetoric that we just heard from our respected leader just earlier. Let's work together and do it a bipartisan way, the way we tried to do it in the Energy and Commerce Committee. I yield back.
Does the gentlelady reserve?
I reserve. Thank you.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute now to the prime sponsor of the bill, the gentlewoman from Minnesota, who again is constantly working to address affordability issues for Americans.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. Madam Speaker, diabetes does not care if you are a Republican or a Democrat. This disease is absolutely an absolute torrential disease inside working families across our country. This bill has been mischaracterized by the other side. This would lead to a $35 cost for Americans, for Minnesotans, for Part D Medicare beneficiaries and commercial plan beneficiaries. For the vast majority of working families, the price of insulin is simply unsustainable. Many Americans are forced to risk their own lives by rationing doses or skipping treatments entirely. Today, we have an opportunity to save American families thousands of their hard-earned dollars. My bill, the Affordable Insulin Now Act, would cap it at $35 a month. Certainly, our work to lower drug costs and expand access to health care across this nation is not done. But this is a major step forward in the right direction and a chance to make good on our promises to the American people. I encourage all of my colleagues to vote yes. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Rogers, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield to Dr. Larry Bouchon, great member of ENC.
The gentleman is recognized.
2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, we all share the same goal of lowering the cost of prescription drugs, especially insulin.
But H.R. 6833 doesn't get to the actual factors that drive the pricing. The bill before us today is just another attempt by Democrats in Washington to pass a political solution and set federal price controls. And once they open that door, what happens when they don't stop with insulin? What happens when they decide to move on past health care, set price controls on other sectors of our economy? Why not cap what you can sell your house for in order to get the cost of housing down? Congress can't be for government price controls, as that is a slippery slope. Now, some of my colleagues may bring up the fact that Republicans' bipartisan alternative, H.R. 19, also caps seniors' out-of-pocket costs, but let me point out the distinction. It's Medicare Part D. H.R. 6833 caps Medicare Part D and private health plans. That is a direct government price control on private companies. I'm a doctor. I'm also the co-chair of the House Kidney Caucus. I have an acute understanding of how expensive prescription drugs are and the need for Congress to act. However, I also understand that it is a structural issue, and simply slapping price controls on it will not actually solve the problem. This will only raise premiums and shift the cost to patients with other diseases. Thankfully, there's a better way. H.R. 19, the Lower Cost, More Cures Act, is a truly bipartisan solution to lower costs of all prescription drugs, including insulin. The bill caps out-of-pocket costs on prescription drugs and Medicare Part D for seniors, allows high-deductible health plans to cover insulin before the deductible kicks in, increases low-cost options by bringing more generic and biosimilar competition to the marketplace, and increases drug price transparency for patients. And the best part, every provision is bipartisan. So let's get back to work together on bipartisan solutions that actually lower drug prices rather than resort to government price controls and a march towards government-run health care. Madam Speaker, if we adopt the motion to recommit, we will instruct the Committee on Energy and Commerce to consider my amendment to H.R. 6833, which is H.R. 19, the Lower Cost, More Cures Act of 2022. I ask unanimous consent to insert the table of contents of this amendment in the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit.
Without objection.
I yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health Chair, Ms. Eshoo of California.
The gentlewoman from California is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in full support of this legislation, and seated here on the floor listening to our Republican friends, price controls, socialists, killing innovation. I'm not going to use all of my time using their language. How about this? Diabetes kills. Diabetics need insulin. They have to be able to afford it. They've paid their taxes all of their lives, hardworking people. So the cost for this, sign me up for it. Sign me up for it to help people, to invest in our own people. This is absurd that these prices in our country, when it costs $15 to manufacture. So today we stand with your constituents as well as ours to lower the price of insulin for those that need it so that they can go on with their lives. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Washington is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I reserve.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute now to Ms. Schakowsky, who's the chair of our subcommittee, Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Commerce and Consumer Protection.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Americans pay 10 times as much for insulin as do any other consumers in countries around the world, the exact same drug. We have actually the names of people who have died because they could not afford their insulin and started to cut back on their prescribed amount. And that is just unacceptable. Big Pharma has been gouging consumers for a long time, even for life-saving drugs, and it's time to stop it. The Affordable Insulin Now Act will make insulin $35 a month for millions of Americans, and it will save life after life after life. And this is only the start. We have to make sure that all Americans have access, including those who have no insurance. And now I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I reserve.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, also a member of our Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Schrader.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of the Affordable Insulin Now Act. The bill before us today will finally deliver the financial relief Oregonians whose lives depend on insulin so desperately need. By capping the cost to no more than $35 a month in Medicare Part D and commercial insurance, Congress is making it clear that no one should have to cut back, ration, or skip doses of life-saving medication. I'm proud that this policy is a central tenet of my own drug pricing bill that I've worked on with leadership, secured in the House, and passed in the Build Back Better bill. We need to rein in all drug price prescriptions. That's why it's important to negotiate drug prices without stifling innovation like we do in our bill, limit the price increases of everyday drugs to the price of inflation, and perhaps more importantly, limit out-of-pocket costs to seniors to $2,000 or less. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer, also a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
The gentlewoman from New Hampshire is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of the Affordable Insulin Now Act, critical legislation to cap out-of-pocket costs for insulin at $35 per month. I consistently hear from Granite State families about how the rise in costs of insulin is forcing them to put their health at risk by cutting back on doses or skipping them altogether because it's just too expensive. We cannot continue to force American families to make impossible decisions between their medication and their well-being. At the end of the day, the work that we do is about our constituents. And I can say right here, right now, I care more about the well-being of my constituents and their health than I do about the profits of certain companies that seem to be protected on the other side of the aisle. No one should pay more than $35 a month for their insulin, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I reserve. Thank you.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, can I inquire how much time remains on each side of 10 minutes each for Energy and Commerce?
The gentleman from New Jersey has 2 minutes, and the gentlewoman from Washington has 3.5 minutes.
All right, I yield now, Madam Speaker, to Dr. Schreier, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. 1 minute.
The gentlelady is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am delighted that today we will be voting to pass the Affordable Insulin Now Act. This is personal for me. I have type 1 diabetes, and insulin keeps me alive. But this tiny 2-teaspoon bottle that used to cost $40 now retails for over $300. And most of us need more than 1 bottle a month to survive. No one should have to ration their insulin, taking just enough to stay alive, but not enough to stay healthy. That is a dangerous and sometimes deadly tightrope to walk, which is why this bill to cap insulin at $35 a month is so critical for my patients as a pediatrician and for people like me. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Washington is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Pleased to yield. Outstanding member of ENC, 2 minutes, Buddy Carter.
The gentleman is now recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the lady for yielding. Madam Chair, for over 30 years, I was the one who was on the other side of the counter who had to tell the patient how much their insulin cost. I was the one who watched the senior citizens trying to decide whether they were going to buy insulin or buy groceries. I was the one who watched a mother cry because she couldn't afford the medication for her daughter or for her child. I was the one who watched all this happened. And now, I'm finally getting the opportunity to address this issue on the House floor, and I'm saddened that it will do nothing to protect those mothers from the pain of not being able to afford life-saving medications. Make no mistake about this. We all agree on the same thing, Madam Speaker. We want lower prices for drugs, particularly for insulin. But instead of fixing a broken system, this bill aims to control it. This socialist plan of requiring every private insurance company across the country to offer certain insulins, not all, but certain, at a mandated price will have disastrous consequences on seniors and the 217 million Americans who rely on private insurance. We all know that insurance agencies will shift these costs to patients with other diseases. Don't kid yourself. This is like squeezing a balloon. It's going to go somewhere else. We aren't talking about the bipartisan solutions that currently exist, like the lower cost, more cures, H.R. 19. That's what we ought to be talking about. Why aren't we talking about the PBMs, the middlemen? The Berkeley Institute came out with a study last week, Madam Chair, last week, that said that 37% of the price of a drug goes to the pharmaceutical manufacturer. The rest goes to the middleman, to the PBM. The solution is right there before us. This is not going to fix it. This is going to control it, but it's not going to fix it.
Fired.
Madam Chair, I oppose this. We all have the same goal, the same common goal, but this is not the solution. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to Ms. Bordeaux of Georgia.
The gentlewoman from Georgia is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the Affordable Insulin Now Act. Before his death, my father paid $300 for a 10-milliliter vial of insulin that cost about $25 in Canada. Far too many Americans like my father are forced to choose between paying for their medication or buying food for their families. No one should have to make that choice. Georgia has one of the highest diabetes rates in the country, and this measure would provide my constituents with meaningful relief. I urge all of my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 6833 and lower the cost of insulin. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentlewoman from Washington is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm prepared to close, depending upon how many more speakers.
Yeah, I only have one more speaker, but we're
Okay,
not
I'll
really
reserve.
closing, right? We still have more time.
I'll reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield what time remains of my time to Mr. Payne of New Jersey.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the chairman for giving me this opportunity, because I wanted my colleagues on the other side to see what an insulin patient looks like. You're looking at them. I need insulin in order to stay alive. The boot that I'm wearing is not a fashion decision. It's because I have a diabetic ulcer on my foot. The fourth one I've had in 7 years. I have left my insulin in New Jersey, gone to the drugstore when I arrived down here in Washington and said, I need insulin. They said, well, Mr. Payne, your insurance isn't ready to cover it. I said, well, that's all right. I'm doing okay in life. I'll pay for it. She goes back, she gets the bag, she hands it to me and says, $348. What happens to the people that are not at the level of a member of Congress? Think about that. $12
The gentleman's
in Canada.
time has expired.
We're asking it for to be 3 times higher than it is in Canada. Think about that. I live it every single day.
The gentleman's time
And
has
I yield
expired.
back.
The gentlewoman from Washington is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I hear the Democrats talking about this helping all Americans. This does nothing to help those without insurance. Let me repeat this. If you do not have insurance, this does not lower your cost, may actually increase the price of your insulin, increasing competition. to lower prices as we do in H.R. 19 is the way, not dictating a price cap. We have breakthrough biosimilars right now. We had 2 approved last year. Biosimilars that would help bring down the cost savings within our market so that patients would have access to lower cost insulin. But the problem is getting those savings to the patients. The PBMs are the ones pocketing the money. Net prices have come down because of innovation. We can lower cost without shifting them. Let's go to work. Republicans and Democrats, we all want to lower the price of insulin. We can do it without government price controls. We can do it by working together and actually solving the problem. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. First, I want to thank.
Is recognized.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Chairman Neal for his leadership on the Ways and Means Committee in helping to bring this important legislation to the floor. Right now, families and seniors that I represent in Michigan and all across the country are paying too much for prescription drugs, in particular for insulin. That's why Congressman Craig, Congresswoman McBath, and I have introduced the Affordable Insulin Now Act to make insulin more accessible and more affordable. This legislation would lower out-of-pocket costs for Americans with diabetes by ensuring that insurers and Medicare can't charge more than $35 a month out of pocket for this medication. Insulin was discovered over 100 years ago, and since then, little about this life-saving medication has changed, but the price of insulin in the United States has absolutely skyrocketed, and as a result, Americans pay 10 times more for insulin than patients in other developed countries. 1 in 4 Americans who rely on insulin have cut back or skipped their doses due to costs. No one should have to choose between taking their medication as prescribed and putting food on the table or a roof over their head, but people must make that choice because of Big Pharma's unfair pricing practices. This is something I know a little bit about. As a father of a type 1 diabetic, I have seen firsthand how the high price of prescription drugs like insulin can harm patients and harm families. When my daughter turned 26 and got her own health insurance, there are months where she spends a third of her take-home pay because she's diabetic on staying alive. Now, she has her mom and I to back her. Not everybody has that advantage. But either way, that doesn't make it okay. In Michigan, it's estimated that 1 in 10 people have some form of diabetes, and the average sticker price for a month's supply of insulin is $375. For some, it can be as high as $1,000 a month just because they need to take more insulin. That's just not right. Jill Verdier, a type 1 diabetic from my district, was my guest, my virtual guest at the State of the Union this year. She told me that insulin is like air to people with diabetes. They need it to survive. At a time when Big Pharma is making record profits, Congress has to do more to lower costs, out-of-pocket costs, and that's why I fought to bring this bill to the floor with my colleagues, Representative Craig and Representative McBath. I urge my colleagues to vote and pass our legislation to lower costs. This is important legislation. I know we need to invest in cures. Obviously, we would like to see the total price of insulin come down, but it's difficult to hear my colleagues on the other side who oppose the legislation to bring down the cost will also oppose this legislation to keep Americans from having to spend more out of their pocket. I think this is legislation that makes sense. It would help people. It would save lives. I reserve. Balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The debate on this side of the aisle will be controlled by Mr. Smith of Nebraska for 10 minutes. The chair now recognizes Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This issue is so important. I don't think we should just automatically accept a partisan proposal that doesn't even get to the heart of the problem. Today, we actually could be voting on H.R. 19, the Lower Costs, More Cures Act, a bipartisan bill that would not only address the root causes of the high insulin prices, but lower costs for all patients. Instead, and I might say very sadly, we're voting on a partisan messaging bill to give Washington a greater say in Americans' medical decisions while raising premiums on seniors and the millions of Americans with private health insurance. This is nothing more than an attempt by my colleagues on the other side to pass, just piece by piece, their cures-killing socialist takeover of the entire innovation sector. And worse, despite the misleading title of this current bill, it does nothing to lower the actual price of insulin. Instead, it uses budget games and regulations to disguise the actual cost of insulin for all consumers. This is just another instance of misguided health and economic policies coming at a time when more than half of Americans are worried about rising prices and the economy. And of course, like the President's budget released this week, this bill too is only paid for, quote unquote, with gimmicks, adding to our deficit and the core causes of inflation. We can and should do more for the American people who are struggling. The American people expect us to work together. We could be doing that. And Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, my colleague on the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong support of this legislation as a type 2 diabetic myself. For the last 30 years, I know firsthand the high cost of this prescription. There's nothing in my district more prevalent as a disease entity than diabetes. I strongly support it. It's an idea whose time not only has come, but has passed. I yield back.
The gentleman yields.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska.
Madam Speaker, I reserve. Thank you.
The gentleman from Nebraska reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, also a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Doggett.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
To assure a stable supply of insulin and better health at $35 instead of $300 monthly, I fully support this bill for Yolanda, a retired Texas teacher, and the quarter of dependent patients forced to ration their insulin because of predatory pricing. Yet instead of addressing pharmaceutical price gouging, this bill really only shifts how Big Pharma is rewarded. Since this bill does not reduce any insulin prices by a penny, all of us who are insured will ultimately pay through our premiums, while taxpayers are on the hook for $11 billion. For Americans who rely on other types of life-saving drugs, there's also no relief. Big Pharma remains immune from any restraint on its monopoly prices from a Congress that is simply unable to hold it accountable. My further concern is that this bill widens the coverage gap for nearly 5.5 million Texans and 28 million Americans who are uninsured, wrongly excluded from any benefit, and who do not receive any benefit today. While the uninsured population represents 17% of the insulin-dependent population, they constitute 80% of the people who pay full monopoly prices. So help for some, which is important, but a need to do much more for the many who are not covered today. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I have letters from numerous groups representing and reflecting the views of millions of Americans. I'd like to submit for the record these letters.
Without objection. Does the gentleman reserve?
Madam Speaker, I now yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman, an expert in health policy, Mr. Schweikert from Arizona.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker Pro Tem. You do realize what's going on here. And I'm going to be a little sarcastic because I'm frustrated. Insulin prices is outrageous. But why is it outrageous? The fact of the matter is our regulatory mechanic and our payment mechanics are the very things that broke this. And here you do a piece of legislation that will break it more. Please, I beg of the majority, hire an economist. And I'll walk you through some of the facts on it. So you're doing a bill here where you're going to subsidize the dollar amount in the back, but you're still going to keep the regulatory mechanics the way they are, and they're archaic designs. And then you're going to be joyful that individuals will pay, what, $35 a vial? At the same time, we're subsidizing it billions and billions and billions of dollars. Does anyone have a subscription to an aggregator on healthcare policy on your side? You do realize there's a co-op coming out of the ground right now that's going to be $55 for a box of 5. It's lower than your subsidized price, and this is their market price. If you were doing something good for society, you'd actually be moving this COVAX to the top of the regulatory stack and saying we want them to get permitted and licensed as fast as possible because they're still a year plus away. But it's being built right now, and you're about to screw up the solution. And if you really, 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 really care about people, remember, I represent the population with the second highest number of diabetes. I represent a tribal community that's number 2 in the world. Come with me sometime and let me introduce you to some people who've had their feet cut off. If you actually care about solving the misery, read. The science journals have made it clear last November, December, the success. We know how to cure, and for my friend over here, you have a family member, type 1. I know I need to go through the speaker, but a family member with type 1, we know how to cure it now. And there's even the next generation of this, as we've even learned how to do the stem cell, the isolate cell, tag it with a CRISPR, so you can do a biofoundry, meaning it doesn't have to come from your skin cells. We can basically now cure type 1, and the same technology will work for type 2, but we're going to have to deal with some societal issues. If you wanted to end the misery in society, don't build more clinics, don't do a subsidy, get this technology to people. And for those of us who are fiscal hawks and actually care about where we're going, you do realize 31% of all of Medicare spending is just diabetes. 33% of all healthcare spending is diabetes. And so the brain trust here decides, hey, let's subsidize this by billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, screw up the movement to actually have cures, to actually have a co-op provide the product dramatically less expensive. Remember, the co-op is going to bring it in cheaper than the subsidized price without all the taxpayer money. Please, I know the virtue signaling here is powerful. The economics are crap. I yield back.
The gentleman is reminded to direct his remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Nebraska is now recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before I yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, I would ask unanimous consent to include in the record a statement of Chairman Neal that I have here.
Without objection.
Thank you. And to my friend from Arizona, I appreciate his passion. I wish it were true that he had somehow cured diabetes. It would be great news for my daughter and so many other Americans who say that they're looking for that cure in the meantime while we are working to get there. And I appreciate the effort. I do, because I'm on board. I'm completely on board with the notion that we ought to cure this terrible disease. However, until that day comes, let's make sure that the people who depend on insulin in order to stay alive can live to see that day that I know he and I both are looking forward to. With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, my colleague from the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Pascrell.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, thank you.
Danny, thank you. Madam Speaker, the Affordable Insulin Now Act will cap out-of-pocket insulin costs at $35 per month. Not a miracle by any stretch of the imagination. And anyone who supports legislation in this order and others where we address other diseases, obviously, we're working on new situations just about every month. So because you're working on it and you're trying to find a balance of the free market and where the price goes without fixing the price of what something will cost. I mean, we've been called worse things than socialists. When you come to this debate, well, let's settle on that word. Well, what does that mean? You want to get into a debate about socialism? I served in the armed forces. I fought for my country. I'm tired of being called names. 7 million Americans use insulin to stay alive. The average insulin cost rose 54%. You've heard that before. And
yield to the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
thank you. When insulin was discovered, Warren Harding was the president, and the New York Giants won the World Series, yet there was no television to watch the New York Giants. Insulin costs are a national disgrace. For a drug discovered over 100 years ago, a $1,000 price tag for a single vial is an outrage. You know it, and I know it. So get beyond the argument that we're all a bunch of socialists because we want to help people. We're doing what the folks sent us here to do. We can't do it on every drug. We need the technology. The gentleman from Arizona is right on target. It will save lives. If we can't do that, what the heck are we doing here?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield. Thank
The gentleman is reminded to direct his remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
A reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's interesting listening to the debate here, and certainly my colleague, Mr. Doggett, I think very appropriately pointed out, and I quote, "This bill does not lower the price of insulin by 1 penny. It just simply shifts around who pays for what." We've seen that pattern in healthcare across America for some time now, and I would hope that we could learn from that. And, Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, a member of the Ways and Means Committee.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise today in strong support of H.R. 6833, the Affordable Insulin Now Act. I will never forget the day a constituent in my district showed me his bottle of insulin. He told me that one day while traveling in Canada, he found he forgot it, so he went to a pharmacy. He found that that same bottle of insulin that he buys here in the U.S. for $200 cost only $25 in Canada, the exact same product. He started calculating how much it would cost him to fly to Canada once every 3 months and then asked himself, why are Americans the only ones paying these exorbitant prices? Nobody should have to sacrifice just to afford medicine. That's why today's bill is so important. By capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month, this bill will ensure that monthly costs for millions of families are truly affordable. It's time to prioritize the needs of our people so that every American can afford to stay alive.
The gentleman is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think that this discussion that we're having here today is important. I also believe that we need to work together on solutions to actually reduce the cost of insulin. Again, not just shifting around who pays for what, but certainly willing to give my colleague on the other side more information about the information Mr. Schweikert was sharing. Very knowledgeable on the subject. It certainly works with his constituents a lot, constituents in need. And we know that literally millions of people across America are in need for lower cost insulin. We owe them, I think, a much better approach than just simple government intrusion, more government involvement, shifting around the cost. And so I was a bit alarmed earlier when I heard that we should maybe make Medicare prescription coverage more like the VA. We need to remember that the VA offers roughly 50% of the options for seniors or participants compared to Medicare. I don't think we want to reduce the choices that seniors would have with their formularies within Medicare Part D. If anything, we should make sure they have more choices. We know that more choices in the marketplace bring down the price, and we need to focus in that direction. So I urge a no vote on this bill. We owe the American people a diligent effort working together to truly reduce the cost of insulin. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I appreciate my colleagues' support of this legislation. This is important legislation. I will say this. I understand the points that have been made on the other side. As a father of a type 1 diabetic, I am one of those many millions of families that pay very close attention to the important research that we think ultimately may lead to a cure for diabetes. And so I embrace the suggestion made on the other side that we have hope for a cure. I have hope for a cure. Ever since my daughter was diagnosed, I've been waiting for that moment, as she has, for that cure to appear. And if it is just outside our grasp, let's do everything we can to get there. But that's not what this legislation is intended to attack. That doesn't mean we ignore that. It means we continue to push. And I've worked with my colleague on this side of the aisle, Congresswoman DeGette, to try to do everything that we can to find these cures. But in the meantime, let's make sure that there is not a diabetic who is standing at the pharmacy counter with life-saving medication just beyond their reach, not because it's unavailable, but because it's unaffordable to them. And I take the point that while this legislation doesn't do what we all would like to do, and that is to reduce the overall cost of medication through the way markets actually work, negotiation between a buyer and a seller. I mean, that's the way the free market works. Let's let the free market work and not have law that allows the seller to dictate to us the price of a drug that can save lives and make huge profits while there are people in a pharmacy reaching for a drug that they can't get because the price is too high. This legislation will help save lives in the immediate term. I hope there's a day when Democrats and Republicans can come together to establish policy that would allow negotiation on the overall price of these life-saving medications. That would be a solution. We support it. You oppose it. In the meantime, let's do this and save some lives. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnay, and the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, each will control 10 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I rise in support of the Affordable Insulin Now Act. On top of weathering the economic fallout of the global pandemic, Americans are still paying far too much for insulin. This is particularly frustrating given that these are not the prices that consumers in the rest of the world pay. The most commonly used form of insulin costs 10 times more in the United States than in any other developed country. Tragically, there have been recent reports of deaths of patients with diabetes because they cannot afford the insulin they need to stay alive. The Affordable Insulin Now Act would take a historic step to lower the cost of insulin and cap out-of-pocket costs at $35 per month. This means individuals with private insurance could save up to $500 a year. This bill ensures affordable access to life-saving medication for the more than 37 million people in the United States who have diabetes and the over 7 million Americans who rely on insulin to maintain their health and well-being. Madam Speaker, it's past time, but today it's time to finally deliver on our promise to ensure that all Americans can get the medication they need and they deserve to stay healthy and thrive. The Affordable Insulin Now Act brings us one step closer to that promise. There is certainly more work to be done, but I look forward to working with my colleagues to get the cost of prescription drugs under control and to build upon this important first step. I urge all of my colleagues to please support this bill, and I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 6833. Americans are rightly concerned about the price of prescription drugs, but Democrats are trying to solve this problem in the wrong way, as usual. Instead of discussing bipartisan common sense legislation to address the rising cost of prescription drugs, we're debating H.R. 6833. This radical bill is another attempt by the left to advance a government takeover of prescription drug pricing. Don't be fooled. This legislation is a Trojan horse. H.R. 6833 claims to address insulin prices, but what it actually does is open the door to government price controls without addressing the root problem, which is the rising cost of insulin. H.R. 6833 won't lower cost. It's a smokescreen that will raise premiums for workers and seniors when inflation is at a 40-year high. Why are Democrats knowingly raising health care premiums on the majority of Americans when so many families are struggling to pay for gas and put food on the table? 4 out of 5 Americans in large group plans already pay under $35 a month for insulin. This bill will raise the health care costs for the vast majority of working Americans. When insurers are required by the federal government to cover an insulin product, this allows manufacturers to raise the price of insulin indiscriminately. Since insurers can charge only $35 a month out of pocket to the patient, the insurer must make up for the increased cost of insulin by raising premiums for all beneficiaries. With a lack of competition in the market, this bill removes the bargaining power insurers use to keep insulin prices low, leading to increased insulin prices and higher premiums. This legislation will only worsen the root problems of high insulin prices, which is a lack of competition in the market. H.R. 6833 will lead to fewer approved generic insulin brands, making the insulin monopoly even worse. If Democrats really want to decrease the price of insulin, they should pave the way for more competition, not less. This legislation will cost taxpayers $11 billion, giving the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services $1.5 million in FY 2022 to administer these drug pricing caps. Trusting the Washington bureaucracy to manage drug pricing and distribution is a mistake. This legislation would be the largest expansion of federal control over Americans' private health insurance since Obamacare. We must stop the federal government from wedging its foot in the door of our health care system and moving us one step closer to a socialist single-payer system like Medicare for all. In fact, this week, the chair of the Progressive Caucus said she was, quote, fighting to make it the law of the land, end quote. H.R. 6833 sets a dangerous precedent. If the federal government can set prices for insulin, what's to stop it from implementing price controls for every drug on the market or in every other sector of the economy? The free market is the reason the United States outpaces every other country in developing life-saving cures and treatments, particularly countries with socialized medicine. Federal drug pricing mandates will discourage medical innovation, resulting in fewer cures, which will keep Americans from receiving the therapies they rely upon. Instead of perpetuating Obama-era schemes to expand federal control over Americans' health insurance, the Obama administration, Congressional Democrats should bring to the floor H.R. 19, the bipartisan Lower Cost, More Cures Act. Every single provision in H.R. 19 has bipartisan support. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle agree that this legislation will lower health care costs and protect America's status as a leading health care innovator. Furthermore, H.R. 19 sets a new standard in health care affordability. This bill caps seniors' out-of-pocket insulin costs at only $50 a month in the Medicare program. It also allows for high-deductible insurance plans to cover insulin before a deductible kicks in, and it increases the availability of low-cost options for treatment in the marketplace. The cost of insulin, like most healthcare costs in this country, are climbing rapidly, yet total federal control is not the solution. H.R. 6833 is a perfect example of legislative trickery. This bill will lower out-of-pocket costs for insulin for a minority of Americans by bloating premiums and other health care costs for the majority of Americans and leave our health care system worse off. Supporting socialist drug pricing isn't a solution, which is why I'm rejecting this one-sided, harmful bill. I urge my Democrat colleagues to support the Lower Cost, More Cures Act, bipartisan legislation that will lower drug costs for Americans without limiting access to cures. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, a lead sponsor of this legislation and a member of the Education and Labor Committee, Congresswoman McBath.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me the few moments of time, Chairman DeSanya, and thank you so much, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 6833, the Affordable Insulin Now Act. I want to take this time just to talk about the cost of health care and prescription drugs for all those in our community. It's a topic that I hear about every single day from my constituents, and it's something that touches the lives of every single American, whether you have diabetes or not. Today, we'll be voting on a bill that will actually provide desperately needed relief to some of the most vulnerable patients in the United States and in Georgia, all across this nation. There's no time off when you live with diabetes. It's a constant, ever-present disease that influences every aspect of your life. Listen to those that gave testimony to what they live with every single day with this chronic disease. In 1920, before insulin was discovered, it would have been exceptional for those who had diabetes to live no longer than 1 or 2 years. But over the past 100 years, we've been able to save lives with insulin. For over 100 years, it has remained the most effective treatment that we have. And over 100 years later, some estimates state that diabetics spend around $6,000 a year alone on insulin. This is just absolutely unconscionable. For a drug that's been saving lives for over 100 years, we can and we must make it more affordable for Americans who need it to live. And that's why I joined my representatives, Angie Craig and Dan Kildee. I find them to be healthcare champions in introducing this critical legislation. It's just really very simple. The Affordable Insulin Now Act would cap out-of-pocket costs of insulin products at $35 per month for Americans with health insurance. This bill brings a measure of certainty and affordability to every American who needs insulin to continue living a healthy life. And yes, I've heard arguments all this afternoon that talk about that this doesn't take care of every individual in the country, specifically those that are uninsured. We know that. And I assure you, we are not completely satisfied with this either. But if our Republican colleagues would come to the table with us with any measures that you have, compromise, come to the table, consensus, help us build the ability to make sure that every American in this country, whether they are insured or not, has the ability to be able to afford this life-saving drug. We welcome that from you. Because people every single day are dying right beneath our noses. And I'm here to save lives. So I look forward to passing this vital legislation out of the House of Representatives today. And I look forward to continuing to fight for passage with Senator Warnock in the Senate, because as the President so rightly stated, this legislation can and will save lives, and it is long overdue. And I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Thanks. This is a good sounding bill. Everyone knows drug costs in general are too high, and penicillin costs in particular are way too high. But it's a bill with a simple answer. We look at a problem and solve the problem by having the Federal Reserve eventually print more money. $15.5 billion over 10 years. I realize you feel you have a pay for here, but it's just by delaying another program by another year. And as a practical matter, this bill spends $15.5 billion more over 10 years than we would without the bill. We're already told this source of funds, we already use this type of source of funds in the infrastructure bill. It's just grabbing another year. Why don't we just require PBMs to pass on their rebates to the patients as intended? That's something that would cost the federal government, in my mind, no new money. Would be a significant reduction in cost for the individual. I appreciate that so many people on the majority side of the aisle would like to work together with us, and it shouldn't be difficult to find a solution to this problem that's fair to all concerned. Thank you very much.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas and a member of the Education and Labor Committee, Mr. Castro.
The gentleman from Texas is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of the Affordable Insulin Now Act, which would cap out-of-pocket insulin costs at $35 per month and help fight the scourge of diabetes. In 2019, as chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, I organized meetings with leading insulin producers to confront them about the strain their prices are putting on the American people. In each of those meetings, I said the same thing, that for millions of Americans, including a disproportionate number of Latinos, access to affordable insulin is a matter of life and death. And for me and many of us, those aren't just numbers. 4 months before I graduated from college in 1996, my grandmother died of complications from diabetes. If we fail to bring down the price of insulin, more families will suffer just like mine did. But our responsibility is to all our constituents, not just those with insurance. So I co-sponsored Representative Doggett's amendment to extend the benefits of this bill to the uninsured. And I hope we will make that happen in the days to come. But this bill is an important step forward, and I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Person Speaker. And I say Person Speaker because I'm not a biologist, and out of respect to our Supreme Court nominee, I don't feel qualified to say Madam Speaker. But I do rise in opposition to this bill. The Affordable Insulin Now Act is just more of government controlling your health care. Today, Democrats are using insulin as the gateway to their dream of fully socialized medicine, where Joe Biden and his accomplices in Congress have more control over your health care than you or your doctor. After all, they got to decide whether or not you got a vaccine, and they fired you if you didn't obey. If Democrats succeed in setting the price of insulin at $35, the negative effects will ripple across the entire health care market. I invite my Democrat colleagues to read my sophomore economics textbook to confirm what happens when you implement price controls. It's estimated the average cost for the private sector of compliance for this mandate is $2 billion. Not that Democrats care about billions of dollars, the way they throw around trillions of dollars. Don't tell them what comes after a trillion. But we all remember the lies of Obamacare. Please say it with me. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Come on, this is participatory. If you like your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan. And a matter of fact, costs are going to go down. None of that was true. And instead, American families found themselves with plans they didn't like, but at least they cost more, so it was a lose-lose. Premiums will rise again if this bill becomes law, because setting prices, again, has consequences, something our economically illiterate Democrat friends apparently don't understand, or maybe they do. American innovation has brought amazing life-saving treatments to the healthcare market, but that research and development comes at a cost. Like any other good or product or service in this country, don't we all want the best drugs, the best medicine, and the best health care? Instead of going with the Democrat default, government knows best, one-size-fits-all mentality. We need to embrace free market principles.
The gentleperson's time has
I have
expired.
30 more seconds. Do we have it? We don't have it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The gentleperson yields back. The gentleman from California is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
The gentleman is now recognized.
Thank you for yielding. What's the difference between us and them? It was just on full display. We care about everyday Americans. They don't. We make life better for everyday Americans. They don't. We get things done for everyday Americans, and they don't. Insulin is a drug that is life-saving and life-sustaining. It's been around for more than 100 years. It's off patent. There are no research and development costs associated with it. Yet so many Americans pay approximately $4,000 a year for insulin. That's unacceptable, un-American, and unconscionable. And that is why Democrats are doing something about it. The Affordable Insulin Now Act will lower out-of-pocket costs to $35 per month. That's not fiction. That's fact. That's not hyperbole. That's help. That is game-changing for everyday Americans. Once again, Democrats deliver for the people.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I believe I have the right to close, so I will reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Insulin prices in the United States are the highest in the world. I support the Affordable Insulin Now Act, a bill that would cap patient costs at $35 a month. It would make life-saving medicine affordable for millions of Americans living with diabetes. My committee's investigation found that since the 1990s, insulin manufacturers have been raising the price of this life-saving medicine despite no improvements to the drug, while making record profits. The price gouging has harmed Americans. More than 1 in 4 Americans with diabetes report having to ration insulin, and some have died. Nearly 2 million New Yorkers have diabetes. Capping out-of-pocket costs to $35 a month is an important step that Congress can take to reduce insulin costs for patients with diabetes. Let's make prescription drugs affordable. Vote for this bill. I thank Kildee, Craig, Macbeth for their leadership in authoring this bill, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute for the gentleperson from Virginia, Ms. Vanberg.
The gentleperson from Virginia is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have been so pleased to hear colleagues across the aisle speak in favor of competition and price negotiations, and I hope that they will follow through in their commitment to supporting competition and negotiation and co-sponsor the Lower Drug Costs Now H.R. 3. But that is not the bill we're talking about today. Today we are talking about Affordable Insulin Now Act, a bill that would make changes in the lives in Virginia of the more than 630,000 Virginians who are living with diabetes. The Affordable Insulin Now Act would finally make sure that every affected child, teenager, family member, every American can afford the insulin that they need. People living with diabetes do not have the choice of whether to purchase insulin or not. They depend on it to stay alive. People like my constituent, Joshua Davis, a 13-year-old Virginian with type 1 diabetes who accompanied Dr. Jill Biden to the State of the Union address earlier this year. I am proud to co-sponsor this legislation to make sure that no American is skipping life-saving doses of their insulin or making choices between whether they take their insulin or put food on the table. I am grateful to my colleagues for leading this effort. Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman reserves.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter.
Thank you very much for yielding, sir. Louisiana has the second highest diabetes mortality rate, but only the 11th highest number of cases. The rate of diabetes among blacks, Hispanics, and Native American adults in the state is disproportionately high as compared to other populations. Insulin is a life-saving medicine, allowing people to live healthy lives, raise families, and do their jobs. However, many can't afford this life-regulating medicine. Many Louisianians have to pay over $100 a vial in out-of-pocket cost every single month, and some are forced to ration prescriptions, risking complications or death. The people must always come before Big Pharma. Today, we're finally taking action to cut the price of insulin. The Affordable Insulin Now Act would cap out-of-pocket costs for insulin for month-long supply at $35 and require plans to cover different types of insulin. The bill is strong move in the right direction to end the burden, and we must do this now. I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I cannot let go past one of our colleagues saying before that we don't believe in helping average people. Yes, we do. Republicans are here every day. We're average people. We're here to help average people. But what we believe in most of all is freedom for Americans. And we happen to believe that Democrats don't believe in that. And this bill is an exemplar of the fact that they want the government to control our lives in every way they possibly can. In the past, Democrats and Republicans have worked together to bring down the cost of prescription drugs. But Democrats have once again pursued politics over progress. H.R. 6833 is a massive power grab that will lead our country one step closer to socialized medicine. That's not what the American people think and want. There's no such thing as a free market system when government bureaucrats control prices. This legislation sets an extremely dangerous precedent. We shouldn't pursue policies that will harm the health and well-being of American patients, and we should not knowingly raise health care premiums on American workers and their families when prices for goods are soaring. Republicans stand ready to work with Democrats to advance legislation that promotes competition, lowers costs for consumers, establishes transparency and accountability in drug pricing, and advances the cause of freedom. H.R. 6833 is not that legislation. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. Gentlewoman yields back. Is expired for debate. Pursuant to House Resolution 1017, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to amend Title 27 of the Public Health Service Act, the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, and the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 to establish requirements with respect to cost sharing for certain insulin products and for other purposes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Bouchon of Indiana moves to recommit the bill, H.R. 6833, to the Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 19, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays, pursuant to Section 3S of the House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma now seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, pursuant to the order of the House of March 30, 2022, I offer a motion to instruct on H.R. 4521.
The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Lucas moves that the managers on the part of the House at the conference on the disagreeing votes of the two houses on the Senate amendment to the bill H.R. 4521 be instructed to agree to Section 2502 of the Senate amendment.
Pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 22, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, and the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Stevens, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I might consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this motion to instruct the conferees on our competitiveness legislation. This motion instructs conferee members to agree to Section 2502 of the Senate legislation. This section is simple and common sense. It says that no person or entity of concern can receive grants, awards, or other support from the National Science Foundation, federally funded manufacturing programs, or technology hubs authorized by this legislation. A person or entity of concern is generally defined by the Department of Defense as directed by Congress in previous Defense Authorization Acts. DoD has identified entities of concern as communist Chinese military companies and companies owned or controlled by the People's Liberation Army. And they've defined persons of concern as individuals affiliated with these CCP military entities. Simply put, this motion ensures that we aren't giving taxpayers' dollars to the adversaries who are trying to steal U.S. technology and use it against us. The Senate was right to add this important guardrail, and it's only responsible that we urge our House conferees to ensure it's included in the final conference legislation. I would like to point out that we wouldn't have this particular difference in our bills had the process of passing House legislation been done in regular order. The Competes Act was developed in a back room by the Speaker's office with very little input or review from relevant committees. Although thoroughly vetted, bipartisan Science Committee bills were included in that package, we were sandwiched in among unrelated partisan spending that added up to a backdoor attempt to pass parts of the Build Back Better Act. Because of this rushed, opaque bill writing process, unsurprisingly, the Competes Act had a lot of flaws. Despite less than 3 days to review the bill text, members submitted more than 600 amendments to the bill. But the Rules Committee, with very little input, made in order only 261